right, and we're ready to get started again. Very excited. We have our last panel and workshop for today. And thanks to HLW for participating this year. Very excited to be welcoming HLW, Google, NBCUniversal, and SRCorriders for designing for equity, what it is, how it works, and why it matters to your organization. Other than that, I would like everyone to give a warm welcome to our panel, HLW, Google, and NBCUniversal, Comcast, NBCUniversal, and SRCorriders. Thanks, guys.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I'm Lee DeVore with HLW, an associate principal, and along with Michele, Neptune, and Matt Triebner, we're going to stand up and wave at you for a second. You'll be seeing a lot more of them soon. We're excited to be here today at Future Offices 2019. Today, we're going to take you through a multi-part session on designing for equity. You heard a panel introduced. Before we get to that, there's going to be a few other parts. Michelle's going to do an intro on equity and what that means, so everyone has a good framing for that. There's also going to be an exercise right at the very beginning. Give everybody a chance to get up off your feet. We know you just ate lunch and probably want to fall asleep, but we'll learn a little bit about you. You'll learn a little bit about everybody else, and it's a good way to break the ice. In 90 minutes, we know we're not going to talk about everything. Equity and creating equitable workplaces are a really complex subject. There's often difficult conversations with it, and it also involves a lot of stakeholders who might not be part of your design processes right now. What we really want to do today is give people tools to start these conversations. I gave you an overview about how it's going to go. Look, you're not here to hear me, you're here to hear all of our wonderful experts here, and without further ado, I'm going to bring up Matt to start on the constellations.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Great. So this is a pretty easy exercise. We do this a lot with clients. It's a great way to visualize information very quickly, which is why we love it. Has anyone ever played constellations before? Okay, so we've got some people who know what they're doing. All right, it's very, very simple. What's going to happen is I'm going to say a statement, and if you agree with the statement, I want you to get as close to me as possible. So you're going to need to stand up for this. And if you disagree, you're going to go away from me. And if you're somewhere in the middle, you can sort of map yourself based on those two polar extremes. Does that make sense? Okay, we'll do a practice one. I'm going to stand over here. So the first one is, and you guys are going to have to stand up for this, so chip chop. I consider myself an outdoor person. Do you agree with that statement? If you agree, you're coming over here. And if you disagree, you're going over there. Okay, so these are the outdoor people. Is that right? Okay. What's your name? Susan. Susan, what have you done outdoors recently?
A lot of walking.
Lots of walking. Are you from New York? She's not from New York. Okay, so that's our practice one. Next, and see who's around you. See who else are outdoor people. See who else are not. I see someone way at the back who is clearly not an outdoor person. All right, I grew up in a city or suburb. Do you agree with that? If you grew up in a city or suburb, come towards me. So at the back, we should have the country bumpkins. I can say that because I grew up on a farm, and I am a country bumpkin. Okay, so everyone here, with the exception of those folks way in the back, grew up in cities or suburbs. Great, okay. I drive a car to work on a regular basis. Okay, so you guys are commuting into work on a daily basis. Where do you work?
At a design firm in Austin, Texas.
All right, so next, I prefer winter over summer. Maybe a better expression would be, I prefer New York winters over New York summers. Okay, no one agrees. I'm assuming this is specific to Austin. Okay, so we prefer the Austin winter over the Austin summer. I'm a January baby, as in you were born in January. You guys? Okay, any birthdays? January 2nd? 8th? 8th? Okay, so a few 8ths. Sunday. Okay, so this gentleman here, Mark, will be celebrating his birthday on Sunday. So wish him a happy birthday. Thank you. Okay, next, go Rams. Oh boy. Oh God. Everything's falling apart. Oh no. Okay, so we have a few Rams. Now, are there any Pats fans, or is this just anti-Pats? Okay. All right, so we have, no one's really pro-Ram, they're just anti-Pats. Okay, next, I enjoy horror films. Okay. Just one or two. I have traveled alone for pleasure. Okay. Where did you go? Oh. She had a Nordic adventure, Copenhagen, Helsinki, and Brussels. What was your name? Sarah. This is Sarah. And then finally, if you could chuck it all and go live on a boat, you would. So these are actually, those three questions, I enjoy horror films, I've traveled alone for pleasure, and if you would chuck it all, if you could, you would chuck it all and go live on a boat. Those are the top three indicators for compatibility. So if you see someone around you who has answered similarly, just FYI, there may be something there. Okay, this is not the career I expected. Yeah, if you agree with that statement, come towards me. Sorry. Okay, so, wow, a little bit of mix. All right, I have a clear understanding of what universal design is. Okay, not a lot. All right, some folks up here. Lee is, yeah, I would hope so because, yeah, we're leading this discussion, so I would hope that we have some idea about what it is. But we do have an expert who's going to illuminate us shortly. I have worked on a project that has incorporated universal design. Okay. I have a clear understanding of the difference between equality and equity. Yeah, it's getting tricky. And then we got two more. I have been in or witnessed a situation that seemed inequitable, but I didn't feel comfortable or equipped to say something. Okay. And then finally, I feel that I'm qualified to address issues of equality, diversity, and or equity in my day-to-day role. Thank you, Rachel. Okay, so we've got a little bit of ambivalence with these last ones. So this is really how we start understanding, where people lie on certain positions, what they understand, what they don't understand. It helps us to sort of shape this workshop going forward. So thank you very much. You can all have a seat, and we'll hand it over to Michele.
So based on those constellations, it sounds like not that many of you feel comfortable about the terms equity, equality, et cetera. So what we're going to talk about today is equity in general, but we want to start with a few definitions. Within this space, you'll often hear several words used together and sometimes interchangeably. They are diversity, inclusion, equity, and equality. They are not interchangeable. They are very different words. If I do this right. So using some definitions from the Ford Foundation, this is the only slide I'm going to read to you. Diversity is the representation of all our varied identities and differences collectively and as individuals. Inclusion builds a culture of belonging by actively inviting the contribution and participation of all people. And the topic of our session today is equity. Seeks to ensure fair treatment, equality of opportunity, and parity in access to information and resources for all. Within this dialogue, you'll often hear people say equality and equity together, as if they were the same. They are not. Borrowing from a very popular cartoon that was created in 2012 and has been circulated since, adapted hundreds of times and in different languages. This is HLW's version on it. What we have is an equal distribution of resources or opportunities. And what you'll see is that we don't have an equitable end result. So when we talk about equity, one of the first things we want to acknowledge is that not everybody's even starting from the same place. And in this solution, we've distributed ladders so that what we have in the end is an equitable result. So that's a very helpful tool, and sometimes when you're having these conversations, having these graphics at your disposal can help you convey some of these complex issues to the people you're working with. So how does it work in your space specifically? Traditionally, how does the controller work? Okay, so traditionally when we think about equity, and we're looking at foundations of equity, we know ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, which was signed into law in 1990. And what we have more recently is a movement towards creating more better equipped and dedicated mothers' rooms. So these are things that we're really seeing and are kind of a baseline now, whether it's by code or by policy. And when we talk about aspirations and what's next, one of the things we can talk about is religious diversity through the creation of non-denominational prayer rooms. We can address barriers of gender expression through gender-neutral restrooms, and we can also talk about universal design. And one of our panelists is very much an expert on that, so I will let Tracy talk about that. But essentially, universal design is providing access to all abilities beyond ADA. So why does it matter to your organization? Why are we really here? So over the last year or two, we've been bombarded with the terms wellness and well-being. Everybody wants to do wellness and well-being. Let's talk about the difference between the two. These two words are not interchangeable either. Wellness is really a focus on physical health, and well-being is a more holistic approach that also includes a focus on emotional, social, or mental health. And why are we thinking about this? So we've all heard that employees are a company's most valuable asset. And we also know that the physical spaces that we build for them have a demonstrated impact on their well-being. So if we look at a few stats, this is from a report by the Global Wellness Institute, that in the US, the cost of employees' work-related stress is $300 billion a year. And we've also seen that if an employee, in the bottom left, if an employee identified their company as caring about their health and wellness, that employee's overall health, stress, and job engagement satisfaction improves significantly. So what we're talking about is some of these aspects, certainly when we're talking about stress, workplace stress, or a caring company, involve many, many factors, but we're extrapolating this data and saying that the spaces that we create obviously impact the health and well-being of our occupants, and equity or equitable design is an enormous part of that impact. And with that brief introduction, I'm going to hand it over to Matt and our panel.
All right. We didn't have assigned seats, but this is perfect. Okay, so Lee mentioned at the beginning of the conversation that we don't have all the solutions, and so we thought we would start talking to some people who know a little bit more about this than we do. So up here with me, I have Tracy Needles from Google, Sydnee from Corriders, and then Rachel is from Comcast. And I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves because obviously they know a lot better about the work they do before we go into a moderated discussion, and we'll have some Q&A throughout. So Tracy, why don't we start with you, if you could tell us a little bit about your role at Google.
Sure. Hi everyone, I'm Tracy Needles. Thanks for having me, Matt. I'm a regional facilities manager here in New York, so my day-to-day job is being the facilities manager, keeping the office running and the Googlers happy. I also have a passion for accessibility and universal design, so I do that as quote-unquote my 20% project, which has also grown into a big kind of passion project for me. So I focus on universal design and working with our designers and all of our project teams to make sure it's woven into our principles as we design our spaces.
And then Sydnee, if you want to tell us about SRCorriders.
Sure. Hi everyone. My name is Sydnee Corriders. I'm actually a social worker by trade, and it came through organizing that I ended up creating my consulting business. So I am a racial equity consultant and essentially collaborate with folks, it can be individuals, but a lot of different agencies and organizations and companies to help to create a more equitable space. So I do workshops and trainings and just long-term collaboration in addressing forms of oppression. So in keeping race central, but really looking at all forms of oppression and how we can create, again, a more equitable space in the workplace and beyond.
Hi, I'm Rachel Hunter. I work at Comcast NBCUniversal in Philadelphia on the diversity and inclusion team, kind of at an enterprise corporate level. So our team is kind of in charge of the strategic oversight on how the entire company, both Comcast and NBCUniversal, approach diversity and inclusion, not just in our workplaces, but also in the products that we create, and the companies that we work with through our procurement process, our community giving, et cetera. So I'll get into a little bit more later, but we have, when it was introduced, a kind of unique approach to diversity and inclusion that's quite decentralized and kind of mirrors how Comcast is organized as a corporation, in that we have embedded diversity practitioners, so to speak, embedded into each of our corporate functions and all of our business units. And it's their job as people who have a seat at the table from a business perspective to drive forward our diversity initiatives. And then our department is in charge of basically wrangling all those cats to make sure that the corporation as a whole is really strategic and forward-thinking in how we're approaching diversity and inclusion across our business.
Okay, thanks, guys. Thank you, ladies. Sorry. The first thing I wanted to start off with was Tracy, because based on the constellations discussion or the constellations exercise we just did, it sounds like there's some people who are actually unfamiliar with universal design. And I was saying before the panel, I literally had no idea what it was until maybe 2 years ago. So could you give us a little bit of a background in that?
Sure. Universal design is an aspect of thinking about design from a different perspective. So it's the idea of going above and beyond code to try and design our spaces so that they're as accessible for as many people as possible with little need for modification. So the idea is really thinking about design from the start. So just to give a little caveat here, it's not about giving people a specific set of guidelines. It's more about thinking about universal designing. It's about really weaving it in, like I said, to the principles of how we design our spaces. So it's thinking, and my team will tell you this, I ask the question at every project meeting, it's thinking, how would someone who's blind use this space? How would someone who's in a wheelchair use this space? So making that part of your process so that no matter who's in your space today, tomorrow there might be someone in a wheelchair, so you don't need to go and change the space. Also, so it doesn't look like it's a hospital, it doesn't look different. It should be a beautiful space regardless of how it's designed. And so there's different principles that you can weave into it, but it's really just about creating really beautiful space that functions for all abilities. And it's, as a facilities manager, it's something that, lowers cost over the life of a building. There's all those sorts of reasons for it. Yeah, so that.
How is it, if I, just to play not devil's advocate, but if I didn't know any better, how is this different from ADA?
Good question. So ADA kind of lays the groundwork for very specifics of, you can get around ADA if you try, because you could get around any guidelines if you work at it. So for instance, you have to have a door opener at the entrance, but it doesn't say anything about door openers from that, because now that we build these offices that have so many different amenities, there's nothing about the pathway from the entrance to your desk, to the event space I want to get to the mother's room that we're adding. So now you've limited someone and they can't get to all of these great things that you've built. So while ADA doesn't say that we need door openers or a path of travel that's accessible, we think it's really critical that that's integrated into our design, because when you don't have that, your experience coming to work, you can't bring your full self to work, you can't be independent. There's some of those, so that's just one example of how it kind of differs.
Right, so you're creating a sort of equally awesome experience for everyone, regardless of their level of ability.
An equitable experience, I would say.
Equitable experience, thank you. I want to switch over to Rachel for a second. If you could tell us just a little bit more about the role that community plays in the workplace for Comcast.
Sure. I think I'll use our ERGs as the best example of that. And for anyone who doesn't know, ERGs are employee resource groups, often called affinity groups, in different places. And they are, at kind of the very least, used as an opportunity to help employees find people of similar backgrounds or similar passions within the community at your workplace, and use that to build networks, to, some oftentimes will promote sort of professional development programs, resume workshops, things like that are very career driven. But we launched them probably almost 10 years ago at Comcast. NBCUniversal has actually had them since the 80s with their first LGBT, they had the very first LGBTQ employee resource group in the country. And so we've actually leveraged them as really an asset to the business, as focus groups, as kind of first line of defense for new product offerings. We have, for example, our My Abilities is our ERG for people with disabilities, and we often will pilot new, and by the way, any employee of Comcast gets free cable, so we all have free Comcast cable. So often we'll give the members of the employee resource group for people with disabilities early access to new features to help us figure out, for like that 2-week period, are there any kinks with it from an accessibility standpoint? So we really take advantage of that, that kind of built-in focus group, and I think that gives our employees the opportunity to feel like they really own our products even more. And that applies not just for people with disabilities, but also our Black Employee Network. They get access to kind of as a member of that ERG, I have access to the Black History Month offering that we're gonna launch on February 1st. It's on my TV already. So that's really a way that I think we help the employees feel like they don't just have a way of meeting each other, and they're kind of like grassroots, building opportunities for community there, but they also are brought in as a valuable community to the business. And that gives a lot more opportunity for them to point out ways in which the company has maybe not gotten it right, or ways they can do better. And I think that that's sort of the best way that we've found to empower the communities within our companies. And we can get to this later, but we've also used that in designing some of our new spaces in Philadelphia as well, which has been incredibly helpful.
So you're leveraging them as resources for the design of space as well?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want me to get into that now?
Why don't we pause on that? Because I want to ask Sydnee about a few things. Because I think when you start describing, facilitating a workshop to address some of these issues, for me, it's very abstract. So what is this actually like? Who is bringing you in? Why are they bringing you in for these conversations?
So I've worked with like a large variety of agencies and companies. I've worked in school settings, and really what the workshops look like are largely self-awareness initially, right? Because I think a lot of times, and I was thinking about this when Tracy was speaking about accessibility and universal design, which is a new term for me, but I really feel like that's something that is embraced in the idea of being a racial equity consultant, and the idea of just like, how are we being person-centered, right? And not about just meeting, so we don't get sued, right? Meeting certain rules. I mean, and that's a lot of how folks think, is liability based, and like, what do we need to do to just like get through so that there aren't really any issues? If someone comes with it, we can say, this is what we're doing, right? But how can we really be person-centered so that just like everyone is able to feel like this is an equitable space for me? And I think the next step that when folks are bringing me in is they might have that intention but aren't quite sure how to get there. So it's like, all right, so what should I do? Tell me what needs to be done for this to be an equitable space. And not recognizing that we have impacts in the ways in which we're interacting, and the policies that we're enacting, and the ways in which we are setting up design space. All of these different things are, while they can feel very objective, are still informed by us in the ways in which we think. So the first piece is the self-awareness and normalizing that we're not going to know it all, right? That we have, in our society, been socialized, regardless of what we believe, we've been socialized in large ways to believe those things. And so how can we, at the very least, be aware of the ways in which we have been socialized, and say, wow, that feels like, that kind of sucks, that's not great, right? And, if that's how you feel, and at least I'm aware now and can be able to make more informed decisions. So it's really, for me, a lot of my work is normalizing that, because I think the defensiveness can come up if folks are, you can start to feel threatened of your personal identity, right? Of like, well, I'm not a bad person, or I'm a kind person, or, you know, I don't have bias against, you know, X, Y, or Z. And really normalizing that we all have bias just because of the ways in which we've grown up and what we've learned. How can we be just, again, aware of those things and work to, that for me is the first step of creating an equitable space, because I think we'll often keep coming up with issues. The less informed that we are, the less aware that we are, and the more action we're trying to take, the more harmful we can actually be.
So, you know, in the room we've got designers, real estate folks, facilities people, strategists like myself. I'm curious from a tangible way, you know, what have you done recently? I'll ask this to Tracy and Rachel first, to build a space that might not have been the status quo, where you're being responsive to someone else's needs.
Big question. I think it's been a iterative process, first of all. Like, I think there's by no means one like golden thing that you can do. So what we've done is we've done research. We've listened to our users. So I think it ties into the ERGs. Like, we've tapped our resources, and one of the big things we've heard is it can't be for us without us, is the term that is used a lot, which is we need to include the people that we're designing to help in the design process. So we do a lot of reaching out, testing the ideas, talking with them. And one small example that I can share is things came up around people who are blind that use a cane to get around. And something that's often a problem in our Chelsea campus, because it's really old buildings, if you've ever been in Chelsea Market, there's a ton of pipes that stick out that are about like an inch or two off from the wall. And so in our spaces that were already open, the Googler would complain that his stick would get, or his cane would get stuck in between the pipe and the wall. This was a pain. It seems like a really small thing, but every day, if you imagine this happening, it just starts to wear on you. So first we fixed that in the existing space, and then I made it a priority every time we review plans to think about what is the path that someone with a cane would travel. So there has to be at least one side of the hallway that's just flush and straight. So it's not like we have to cover every single pole, because that would drive our design team crazy. But you have to pick one side of the wall. So someone with a cane just gets used to traveling on the right side. It's going to be straight. We'll just put some drywall up, something like that. So it's those small things where you take an issue and make it a trend, and then you weave it into future design. So I always talk to my facilities teams on the ground to keep their eyes open for those tickets that come in about complaints, and not kind of brush them off, and make sure that they're raising them as issues. Because it may seem like a minor issue, but this Googler has been very vocal, and we've worked together, and actually worked on education as a huge part of what I do, to make sure Googlers are also super educated on the topic, because we can build beautiful spaces that have 6-foot wide hallways, but our Googlers come in and stick a big stuffed teddy bear in the hallway, or lockers in the hallway, and now that hallway is no longer accessible. So we do a lot around education, similar to the work you do, just teaching people why they should care, and why they can't leave their scooters in the hall. Education is a big part of that, so it's all weaved in there. It's a small example, but small changes are big changes.
And it's something that I guess when you describe it, you know, his cane gets stuck. But if that's happening several times a day, every day, that would drive a person insane.
And the way he explains it to me, which is how I've explained it to everyone that I've kind of done these ad hoc sessions for, is if you imagine waking up in the middle of the night and having to travel to the bathroom with no lights on, and you get the path down, but then your 2-year-old leaves their toys all along the floor, and so you fall because they haven't thought to clean up. That happens every time he's going to the bathroom. So you imagine he's a lawyer for Google, so his stress levels are already up there. Now we're adding to his stress every time he just has to go to the bathroom. So like, if all you have to do is clean up to make his stress level go down, it goes back to some of the stats you shared about like stress at work. It's that kind of like realization for people needs to get there before they say, oh, maybe I should clean up after myself.
Right. Rachel, you had started to allude to it, but I cut you off.
Yeah, I think I have a similar kind of simple but really helpful example. Another thing that we've we have an entire accessibility team that's really focused on our products, kind of our X1 set-top box and things like that. And something that their philosophy is kind of when you design universally, it makes the product better for everyone. And like a really subtle example of that is something that I had never considered before, but I think is pretty common in universal design is so we just opened a brand new Comcast Technology Center in Philadelphia. It's now the tallest building in Philadelphia. Second tallest is our HQ. So we have the two largest buildings in Philly. And in that new space, they designed all of the floors very specifically for people with canes. And so any concrete floors are always hallways, passageways to other parts of the building. It always leads to an elevator of some kind. All the workspaces are wood. And then all the communal, like, lounge areas are carpet. And for people who are blind, it makes it very easy for them to understand kind of what kind of space they're in at the outset. But then for those of us who are not blind, it also creates little nooks and areas. And, it's also a completely open workspace, which is very new for Comcast. People are getting used to it still. No offices, no nothing, just large conference rooms. And so I think creating those little nooks and areas has also made it a lot more kind of inviting and homey for those of us who are getting used to being in an open workspace. And so it just made the entire experience for everyone in this new space really wonderful. But it was born from an accessibility need or request, which came from one of our ERG members. So that's just an example that I really loved because I didn't really know that was why we had this really cute areas with carpeting and couches, but it turns out that was actually not in the plans originally. So it kind of goes to that idea that like it's just making the whole space better for everyone.
So this is a question for Sydnee, but I think both Tracy and Rachel, please feel free to address it. Are you seeing a demand, an increased demand for these types of services? Because it sounds like it's not that we weren't empathetic to these concerns or issues in the past, but the awareness has definitely increased. Have you seen an uptick in the demand for those workshops that you're facilitating?
Yes, definitely. I think given our political climate, these are conversations that are being talked about more. I will say the uptick, I think it depends on our various identities, right? I think a lot of folks have been experiencing a lot of these issues and have been, and specifically speaking about race, have been experiencing a lot of these issues and have been aware of them. And I think with the shifting of the political climate, more folks have come on board and been able to, it's a lot more visible, I think, to be able to recognize, well, there might be issues that we should be talking about. So I think, and I think also with just the increase of use of social media and the ways in which things are being publicized and people and movements and companies are being like canceled, of really trying to say like, I don't want that to be me. And balancing, right? I think some folks are really sensitive, like, I don't want the folks in my space to be impacted by these harms, and I think other folks are just like, we really want our company to succeed. And for both of those reasons, folks are definitely reaching out more. I think it's on me to discern, are folks ready for the change that they're asking for? Because I do think it has become a little bit of a culture of like checking a box, right? Of like, all right, great, we got our diversity training, what's the next training that we have? And for me, I really like to have a transparent conversation about that, because that's an okay start if we're really able to lay out, okay, well, let's talk about the difference between diversity and equity, or just in the work that I do, right? Because I don't necessarily work towards diversity. We can talk about hiring practices and diversifying, and I think there's a lot of strength in diversity, and I think there's a lot that can go into these efforts. So really just like, what are you saying, and what are you asking for, and what are you looking for, so that we're making sure that we're aligned. And then also, maybe that this isn't exactly what you were thinking when you first asked for it, but do you feel like you're ready to make a shift, because it sounds like this could be really beneficial in this space? But I will also say that employees are asking for it, and that's the work that I often do. Is we've had this issue, some folks were saying they've heard about these consultants that kind of come in, how can we get you into our space? And that for me is really when the folks in the space, working in the ground are asking for this stuff, that's really when often, the change is ready.
So I have a question. Something that's come up, with other organizations is, if we ask the question, are we doing things equitably? How can we engage more people in the process? What if someone says, I need this? Do I have to build it for them? Mm-hmm. I don't know the answer to that. Is that a concern that people have?
I think that's definitely one of the concerns. For me, it's when you say that no, it's not possible. Like, what does that mean? And like, let's unpack that. And also, again, normalizing. We can't accommodate everything and everyone in every space. But how transparent are we? How much are we doing our best to do so? And this can be from a design perspective, and also just in general in working towards having more of an equitable environment, right? So. Because a lot of times I've met folks who have shared, like, I just don't think that's possible, and then by the end of it we have we have a great solution and new project that's happening. And I think it's broadening our minds, right? If we have this particular way of thinking, and that's again where the self-awareness comes from, if we have a particular way of thinking, we're not even able to imagine or envision what this could look like. And that's, for me, the fun part of my job is I don't really go in and like teach folks, right? We go in and collaborate and say, given what you're saying, like, what might this look like? And being able to kind of witness that growth over time has been really a privilege of mine. But yeah, I think a lot of times it's not stopping there for me. It becomes a battle because I'm someone that's coming in from the outside and wanting to honor their space and their culture while also challenging them to, well, why don't we take a moment? Because we often in this work have a sense of urgency, right? And what would it look like to say, maybe we can't find a solution right now, but how can we slow this process down and work through it? And oftentimes we're finding a way to really make some large improvements.
So I want to talk about a few more examples that we see, but before I do, are there any questions from the audience that we want to tackle? Yes, birthday boy.
Yeah, I can caveat it that I'm usually the client, so I get to request the things. But I have had to sell this to our I'm a facilities manager. I have to sell it to the project executives that have to then, and I have gotten a lot of pushback. So to Matt's earlier question, this has always been something in terms of accessibility that has been brewing for a long time, but the selling of it has taken a long time to get to today. The one thing I've found is the heart of universal design is the aspect that kind of what you were talking about, Rachel, like what works because it's accessible also works for 10 other reasons. So if you're pitching it, thinking about what else are you gaining from X? So for instance, you're making larger hallways. What else are you gaining by making a wider hallway, like service in terms of like getting pallets through? I don't know who your client is, but there are other aspects that you can show to show why this is important, because I find that relying on stats around disability or diversity isn't really the selling point, because personally, it's hard to get them. I don't think that's where we should lean, because the idea is to be designing for the future, especially in designing physical built spaces. Like once you build it, really hard to change it, especially when it comes to width of hallways and things like that. So that's also a point that I like to make, which is, look, we can't change the width of a hallway once we build it, and this building is going to depreciate over X amount of years. Like, let's get it right from the start. Things like that, and then just weaving in the fact that I don't think it costs that much more. I mean, the auto openers add cost, but if you design it right from the beginning, it might add a couple hours. But if you guys can, be really good designers, maybe you get it done in the same amount of time. But that's kind of how I pitch it. Like, universal design shouldn't really cost that much more if you can find a way to maximize your space. Does that answer your question?
Does that answer your question? Great. Yeah. Do you want a mic, maybe? Okay.
What are some things you've done in existing spaces to accommodate this?
Accessibility? Yes. Oh. So I actually created a whole program around existing spaces because I come from the facilities management background. What we really focused on was things that don't cost anything, because that was the easiest to implement when you don't have to ask for budget. So things like we have a whole staff of vendors that walks our floors, making sure they have an eye for making sure the hallways are cleared. Other really little things like adding tables that are ADA compliant next to doorways, so that if you need to get through, all of our doors typically have a badge reader next to them. People are carrying a lot of stuff. It can be helpful to have a table there. Things like making sure there's signage to make sure people know where the accessible route is. Those are all the things that don't cost anything. And then one thing we're doing is putting together a capital plan to add auto openers, because that's really my #1 pet peeve, is that we build spaces without auto openers. And once you do that, it at least lets people through the front door, which I think is a huge barrier to entry.
All right, I'm going to keep going. I had a few, we've been talking a lot about people of different levels of ability. There's some stuff that's been coming up with a lot of our clients recently concerning either gender or race. One of the big ones, and this was something that kind of came up unexpectedly, but a client approached us about reconsidering their art program, because a lot of the art that had been included was it was colonial, it was depicting scenes that were not okay, effectively. And ultimately what happened, though, was a board member pointed it out, and they sort of said, this needs to go. Are you seeing issues that are sort of beyond accessibility issues in the workplace that need to be addressed?
Yeah, there's one similar, going back to the building that we just built, that I recently learned about, where we surveyed a lot of our ERG members to kind of ask them, what about the current Comcast HQ building that was built in 2006 frustrates you? What could be improved, or what would you like to see in the new building that we're building? And the Women's Network and our Tech Women organization came together and actually had a lot of strong feedback about, ironically, our telecommunications system, which we are a telecommunications company, but like our VC system in the HQ building, it was super outdated. And as a result, it made it really difficult to work from home as a new mother returning to work, or just a mother of small children. And so they felt like, even though we have a very wonderful work from home policy and great maternity policies, in actual practice, those women didn't feel like they could work from home because the VC system was really shoddy, or we just didn't have an experience for someone remote that made them feel like they were really in the room. And that was something that they asked for us to upgrade. And it was, as you can expect, hugely expensive. And that was not the only reason why they did it. I mean, the system was really outdated. But it's one of the reasons that they talked about, where we want to be a company that's attracting, diverse millennial talent. We're competing against the Googles and the Apples in terms of trying to hire technologists. And in order to do that, we have to really think about the kind of experiences that we have for people who don't necessarily come to work every day. And so we've completely overhauled the telecom system that we have. I still am trying to learn it, because it's kind of confusing for me, but apparently in the new building, it's hugely successful. People love it, and they're actually going to upgrade our building. I'm in the old, boring HQ building. They're going to upgrade our entire building to have the same system, so that you can actually telecom between buildings, which they had not originally planned to do. So that's just another example of a non-accessibility kind of upgrade that came from our female ERG group, specifically for mothers working from home.
And just speaking to, this is what you asked, kind of had me thinking of, just in ways that we can normalize this, right? And that we're not catering to particular groups, but really normalizing across the board, which is why I really like this idea of universal design, and just being universal in thought. And that for me is like what inclusivity looks like. So thinking about Michele when reading the slide, right? That she showed the slide and we have slides on either side and she also read the slides, right? Like even that we could have just looked at the slides and she could have done just a quick overview, but who are we accommodating and being able to read the slides for everyone, right? I'm working on, I usually introduce myself along with sharing my pronouns, which are she and they. Meaning when you refer to me that when you're talking about me, you can say, yes, she just said this or they just said this, right? And what pronouns are is the way that we like to be referred to. And it's normalizing the idea that we don't ask certain people, right, how they'd like to be referred to, but what would it look like to really introduce yourself and model that? And to not make those assumptions. Because often what we do is we look at folks and we say, based on how you look, you're probably like to be referred to as X or Y or Z. And I think these are really like, right, he or she. And I think these are really like newer things that folks might have reactions to, and they make up for a lot more of a welcoming space. And I just think of like those small ways that when we're having different activities, how are we thinking about how everyone might be able to participate in the space? And so those are different ways, things that come up, those issues of not being seen, right? Like when we have bathroom signs and we're moving to all gender bathrooms, but then we have images that show like what a man or a woman is supposed to look like still, right? And saying that all of those folks can be in this room, but what would it look like to just have a sign that says all gender bathroom? So just like moving further, that's not, what we're doing is, again, I think it takes time and it takes, again, as our awareness expands and we're able to gain more information on like what inclusivity really looks like. But for me, that's the piece about equity. And we did talk about that slide where the equity is adding the different ladders. Do you mind? The equity is having the different ladders as opposed to, what was the equality slide? Right, so everyone has the same ladder, right, in this equality slide. And then when we talk about equity, it's offering that, so they're trying to see something. The piece of like justice would be, we don't need ladders because there's no barrier, right? So what would it look, and that's another image that's been going around, but how can we move even further to equity because equity is acknowledging the different systems that are at play and accounting for them, right? So we know that there are barriers for certain people, so we're going to keep those barriers in mind and then accommodate for them. And that's wonderful, that's even better than the idea of equality, which is offering everyone the same resources and not acknowledging the systemic barriers and just saying, you all have the same opportunity, we wish you the best of luck. So equity is wonderful, and this image I think is incredible that we have to keep these systems in mind. But for me, the next step, and I think we can take it step by step, right? But to be constantly keeping in mind and allowing us to get a little radical in thought and to get creative in thought and to give ourselves the permission to really push ourselves even past that and to be forward thinking is how can we create spaces or create environments and communities that don't need ladders at all?
And there's a certain way of thinking about it that I think a lot of us, myself included, are still pretty new to. One of the things that we were talking about in prep for this was about there's this sort of thing that keeps happening where people consider a sick room and a lactation room or a mother's rooms interchangeable. And if you ask any mother who's used a lactation room, she will tell you exactly why that is not an acceptable way to do that. But if you have a limited budget and you have limited space, well, why do we need this sick room and a mother's room? Can't they be multi-purpose? So I think for a lot of us, it's just like starting to understand that, starting to build more empathy for the folks that were around it. And all of you have spoken very eloquently about the engagement that you do. So it's about engagement, it's about hearing from the affinity groups or the Googlers or the clients that you work with, Sydnee, to understand those pain points. Are there specific processes in place, for all of you, where it's like this is where we go and we talk to the users so that we make sure that we're not missing something?
We actually have a new one. I was going to mention it before, but we have seen an uptick in some of the just people noticing things, which is great. So for instance, there's a mural that's been on the wall for 7 years and no one's ever noticed it, and then someone realizes that it's pretty offensive, which is good that finally someone's noticing it, but we realize that we need a better process in place because Google's pretty large. And one of the things we were trying to do, which you touched on, which is how do we normalize it so we're not just getting input from one really loud ERG group, we're making sure we're getting equality from all of the ERG groups. So what we did was we created an ERG AC, because we like acronyms. So it's an Employee Resource Group Advisory Committee, which pulls employee resource groups from across the country, plus Latin America, plus Canada, as well as a diverse from region. So it's not all from New York, so you're not getting a New York perspective. And this allows any project team to submit like room names or graphics to this group so that they can raise any red flags, because again, it goes back to like, you can't do it without us. So we can't see the perspective from an indigenous lens. So we submit it to them. They have a week to get back to us, and it's raised a lot of red flags before they're even designed, so that I can say, look, no, that name is not gonna work because of X, Y, and Z, educate the people, get a new name. So it's been hugely successful in that we're able to vet so much more, and we don't actually have to do the work. And they want to do the work because this is what they're passionate about. So it helps to create that sort of scalable process that we need, because otherwise it was very daunting to look at.
And in my work, really quickly, the piece that I do is, because a lot of times, because of who has the budget, it's the leadership in the different agencies that are the folks that are bringing me in, or that I'm having the more of the conversations with once I'm at the table. And so a lot of my work is breaking that piece down and saying, like, who's missing from this space? Like, who are the stakeholders? How can we recognize, like, again, I do work across various identities, but largely keeping it race-centered. So like, even not necessarily regardless, but in addition to there being folks of color in this room right now, how can we still recognize power in the way that's playing out in the different spaces? So how can we have just a variety of different folks in the room or in different rooms, right? Like, how can we also have conversations with just those groups and then conversations with all together to be able to really hear that variety of voice?
Yeah, I can add one more example, I think, again, to going to our new building, which is our shining bright star in Philadelphia right now. But so more along the lines of, it's not really a policy, but I think empathy goes a long way with a lot of this. And you kind of touched on it with the kids' toys analogy. So we actually have in this new building an entire floor dedicated to a Comcast showcase. And it's basically like a mock loft apartment where you can see how each and every one of our products works. Like, we have home security, internet, TV, et cetera. And in part of that showcase tour, there's a bedroom specifically with all the accessibility components of our products. And every single employee has to go through the showcase lab tour, which includes that. And in that room, they have like a sensory deprivation, I guess, thing, so that you can use our X1 platform without and then with each accessibility feature as if you had that disability. And it's really eye-opening for our employees to have empathy with customers who are using those products every day and understand why we have them, particularly for sales employees. I mean, there's a business case for that as well. But then also, if we bring in any third-party partners like Netflix, NASCAR was just in the building a couple weeks ago. When they go through the showcase lab, they end with the accessibility tour. And I think it just shows our partners that we're really thinking about every single customer that we could be bringing to their product, and gets our employees thinking about how they can reach, how they can better serve our customers and have empathy for those situations. So I guess it's kind of a unique way that we've leveraged our workspaces to create an opportunity for our employees to better empathize with our customers who have disabilities.
And if it's okay, I just wanted to say, to validate and really highlight that work, because I think a lot of times the labor ends up being on the folks who are most marginalized in the spaces or in the environments to educate folks. Like, if they first have to bring up like what the problem is, and then they have to educate, like, so that folks who may not be aware in that moment become more aware and make a change. And this is sounds like a really great opportunity for everyone to be able to get this education, but not on the labor or the backs of the folks who are most impacted.
Any questions before we wrap up? Go ahead.
So, a lot of us live in a world where companies want to do these things, but at the end of the day, it comes
Yes. And I don't have all the numbers, but we did do that. And on a small scale, I did it specifically to showcase, again, going back to the auto openers. I can tell you for a fact an auto opener in New York, I think it was about $3,000 to $5,000 more to do it after the fact than it was before. But again, there are some things you just can't do after the fact. Like you could never make a hallway wider. But someone one of the people I work with in California did a benchmark of an entire project and like wrote out a whole thing. And it wasn't significant. The only cost that was really additive was some of the design time and those auto openers. But I think it goes back to, look, if someone comes, the way I pitch it is if someone comes to work and needs that auto opener, it's going to take you probably 3 to 6 months to get it installed. Now that's 3 to 6 months that new person is not experiencing their best day at work. Plus, it's going to cost you more in installing it, and you're going to have to do it anyway, probably, if you're the right company. And so when you think about it that way in terms of long term, it's not, and the auto opener, I focus on that because that's where everyone always gets stuck, is not just for really long-term disabilities in a lot of ways. Like, people get hurt, and so they end up in a wheelchair, and they're going to likely come to work. Plus, there's a lot of stats, if you wanted stats about the aging population and the type of people that are coming to work. So there's a lot that you could package in a way, and I know people have to sell things, so that's ways to sell it. But I think just in terms of I've fought that fight, it's a lot, it boils down, it's silly, but it boils down to the auto opener in a lot of ways.
Other questions? Okay. Oh, yes.
I just wanted to ask, so as a medium company, they're just starting to, get into some of these affinity groups and stuff like that. But what I've noticed is that they don't, I've talked to people who are actually in the group and they talk about not having a real impact. What would you suggest in creating that kind of impact, or what would you do in this situation when you're trying to start out these groups and help them to create an impact, I guess?
Well, I'd be curious in how we're defining impact and who is defining whether or not there was an impact. But is it like the folks in the group?
Folks in the group and also and their impact on the community. So their ability to educate, their ability to be noticed.
Can you say more?
So for an example, we have like a women's group and a diversity group, and so
Like racial diversity?
yeah, racial and so the question is more they have meetings, they get together, they interact with each other, but they're finding themselves again closed off from actually the rest of the company.
I see. So again, I think it depends on our intention, right? Because a lot of times these affinity spaces form informally. That folks may feel folks of various marginalized groups may feel othered in these spaces. And so they're checking in at lunch or they're going to grab drinks after to process whatever just happened. And these affinity spaces are often more formalized ways and more institutionalized ways. So it depends on what the impact is, because those spaces, them just having a space for themselves, really might be creating that larger impact of job satisfaction, right? And they often aren't spaces for people to go then and teach, because that again ends up being like could potentially be another burden. If that feels like something that's empowering to them, right? That we have this space, we have things that we want to change or to do, and like we need to have education, then that can be something that's really powerful. If it can be really hard to work in this space sometimes, and we really just like, let's have some community on our own in addition to the larger community, then that's okay. And I do think that sometimes folks who aren't in those groups or identifying in those groups can be like, well, what's happening over there, and feel a little bit left out. I think that's where it's really important to be able to have a culture of conversation. But I think some of it might be just recognizing our various privilege. Like myself as a straight cis person, I'm not gonna know what's necessarily happening in the LGBTQ affinity space, and I'm gonna have to be okay with that. So I think it can be a little bit of a both and of like defining, and maybe that is coming up with a definition of what it is, and maybe that's not challenging someone to come up with a definition, and maybe it's just allowing them to use the space as what's needed.
One other thing I'll add to that is one thing we did was, and it was a gesture that was small but was very much welcome and appreciated, was to show appreciation for the ERGs by giving them a space to call their own. So from a real estate perspective, space is treasured, especially in New York City. So one thing we did was just create a space where they could meet, because meeting rooms were pretty valued. So we created an ERG library and a safe space type space. So it's not kind of just showing that they're valued in the fact that, look, we're going to dedicate a space that you guys and everyone can do whatever you want in it. And then kind of, it just shows that as the facilities team, we appreciate the work you do, but I think all of what you said is just from my FM perspective.
Yeah, I would just add also that kind of to what you were saying, that understanding what their purpose is and that making sure they're aligned with the organization on what their purpose is, and that you have executive champions who are charged with ensuring that they get the resources and kind of accessibility that they need, or access that they need to maybe business leaders outside of that group, and understanding what their purpose is. So like at Comcast, I think it's, and NBCUniversal, it's a lot easier for us, and we use what is called the 4C model. It's not ours, we've stolen it from whomever, but it's career, community, commerce, and culture. And so every ERG is charged within a year to do something impactful in one of those, in all 4 of those areas. And as a media company, the commerce one is really easy and extremely valuable to our business because, like I said, we bring in, the Black Employee Network or the Hispanic Network and show them, like, this is the new content that we want to acquire for on demand. Does this represent, is this authentic to you? Is this good content? Is there somewhere we're not looking? We're looking to launch new networks on our cable platform. Like, we can use them as free focus groups, essentially. So it's in the business's best interest to reach out to them. I think if you guys are in real estate, it's not the same. So maybe there is no commerce pillar, but you have the other 3. And the other thing is, maybe it's just a question of, to your point, if it is about them finding community and creating a better work experience for them, then that's great. But it could also be an awareness thing. Like we have, it's pretty common for ERGs to plan, like during Hispanic Heritage Month, our ERG Unidos does like a potluck, and everyone brings different Latin American cuisine from their countries, and there's so many Latin countries. And so they use it as an opportunity to talk about their, what it's like, kind of sort of the Nicaraguan culture versus Brazilian culture versus whatever. And it's just educating their fellow colleagues and inviting them to that. Our Out ERG manages our Pride Parade impact across the country. And they own that, and we give them budget to do it themselves because, we want to give them the opportunity to manage that. So I think it starts with them knowing their purpose and the company kind of sanctioning that of like, we're charging you with this, and then they can come back to those leaders and say, you told us we were in charge of doing X, Y, Z. In order to do that, we need this from you. And you have to start from that like baseline of agreement versus like them just wanting to make impact without anyone outside of their group acknowledging that.
And I want to highlight too just language and the difference between employee resource group and affinity spaces. Because I think employee resource group is like a true partnership in that there's a dual relationship and dual benefit, right? Like employee resource groups often do a lot of programming but they also get funding from the corporation or company. So I think that those can be really powerful. Affinity spaces, depending on again, how folks define it, can be really more just about the community piece and recognizing that like there isn't another job, right? And so I think there are pros and cons for both, right? Affinity spaces can be after work, they can be during the work. I think it's really powerful to have them during the work hours so it doesn't, again, feel like more work to have this community. And affinity spaces is a piece of the equity in terms of like contributing to shifting a culture if folks are feeling marginalized in this space. Employee resource groups, I think, also has that, and it's more of a dual relationship. So I think both are powerful, and maybe coming with that language too of seeing what feels beneficial for everyone in the space while taking the lead of those different various groups could be. Does that feel?
So thank you everyone so much. This has been awesome. We do have to shift gears. I know we have a very condensed workshop about to take place, but a big round of applause for Tracy, Sydnee, and Rachel. Thank you guys so much.